On the 30th of January 1649, King Charles I, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, was executed by his Republican enemies, whose armies had defeated his forces during the long and bitter English Civil War. The killing of King Charles sent shockwaves across continents. Not only was the act unprecedented in English history, but it signalled to all those countries ruled by hereditary sovereigns, which in the 17th century was most of those nations in the known world, that the divine right of kings and queens to rule over their subjects could be shattered at the sweep of a rebellious axe. In France, Louis XIV's mother, the Regent Anne of Austria, described Charles's fate as a blow which ought to make all kings tremble. Charles's supporters regarded his executioners as nothing less than treasonous and irreligious murderers, who were bent on destroying the very fabric of society, at the apex of which stood the king, appointed by and answerable only to God. The king's opponents and their leader Oliver Cromwell were equally of the view that the king was guilty of treason against his subjects and must face the ultimate penalty for this act. Their charge sheet against Charles stretched back to the beginning of his reign in 1625. They believed him to have ruled as a tyrannical monarch, levying taxes and starting wars without Parliament's consent, unlawfully imprisoning his opponents, and incorrigibly scheming and plotting with foreign forces against his enemies at home. Most seriously of all, Cromwell and his allies believed Charles, whose wife was Catholic, to be a secret papist, and whose religious policies were intended to destroy the English Protestant Church, established by Queen Elizabeth the century before, and restore Catholicism to England. For deeply devout and anti-Catholic Puritans like Cromwell, this was the king's greatest crime. Following Charles's execution, Cromwell was proclaimed Lord Protector of the new Republic, though, arguably, then ruled far more ruthlessly and without a care for life, the will of Parliament, or the rule of law, than the king had ever done. Before his execution came Charles's trial for crimes for committing treason against his people, which began on the 20th of January 1649 in the magisterially medieval surroundings of Westminster Hall. At the heart of the case against Charles was his opponent's unequivocal assertion that monarchs were not above the law, and rather than being answerable only to God, the king was bound by the same laws that bound his subjects. The trial was a great public spectacle, as described by one contemporary historian. At the south end of Westminster Hall, benches had been erected for the men who were to be Charles's judge and jury. In the middle of them, and a little raised, sat John Bradshaw, the trial's president, with a table before him. The benches, president's chair, and table were covered with crimson cloth. Bradshaw wore a black gown, and, considering his exposed position and the feelings the trial would evoke, he had had his hat reinforced with steel plates. At right angles to the seats of the court commissioners, stretching northwards down the hall, were two bodies of soldiers several lines deep, and in the middle of the open space in front of Bradshaw and between the soldiers was a table bearing the mace and the sword of state, at which two clerks sat, ready to make their notes. It was a small man who walked into Westminster Hall, with short steps and hurried gait, under the guard of Colonel Tomlinson's men, and mounted the few steps to the dock. He was dressed entirely in black, with an enveloping black cloak around his shoulders, on which gleamed the large embroidered star of the Order of the Garter. Apart from the deep white collar and cuffs, the only relief was a jewel at his throat, and round his neck the blue ribbon of the Garter, suspending the onyx and diamond George, the king's most precious jewel, which opened to reveal a portrait of his wife. Charles looked slowly round the hall and up at the galleries. He sat down on his red chair, and then stood again and turned to look over the barrier at the spectators and the guards behind him before resuming his seat. His head remained covered to mark his refusal to recognize the court. After Bradshaw had opened the proceedings, John Cook, the Solicitor General, who was standing within the bar by the king, began reading the indictment. But after only a few words, Charles attempted to stop him by tapping him sharply on the shoulder with his cane and ordering him to hold. Cook ignored this and carried on speaking, whereupon Charles poked him a second time and rose to speak. Despite this, Cook continued. Suddenly, incensed at being ignored, the king struck Cook across the shoulder so forcefully that the ornate silver tip of the cane broke off, clattered to the floor, and rolled down by Cook's gown. There was silence. No one stirred to pick it up. So Charles was forced to stoop down, pick it up, and put it in his pocket. On that first day, Charles continually challenged the legitimacy of the court to put him on trial, and refused to enter a plea. The proceedings got nowhere. On the second day he became bolder and more eloquent in his resistance, tormenting Court President Bradshaw, who pressed Charles to enter a plea to the charges against him, saying, "The court expects you that you apply yourself to the charge, not to lose any more time, but to give a positive answer thereto." Charles replied, "It is not my case alone. It is the freedom and the liberty of the people of England. And, do you pretend what you will, I must justly stand for their liberties. For if power without law may make law, may alter the fundamental laws of the kingdom, I do not know what subject he is in England who can be assured of his life or anything he can call his own. My reasons why, unconscious of that duty I owe to God first, and my people afterwards for their lives, liberties, and estates, I conceive I cannot answer at this time till I be satisfied of the legality of it." Bradshaw responded, "Sir, I must interrupt you. It seems you are about to be entering into arguments and disputes concerning the authority of the court. You may not do it." The king replied courteously, "Sir, by your favour, I do know law and reason, though I am no lawyer professed. I know as much law as any gentleman in England, and therefore, sir, by your favour, I do plead for the liberties of the people of England more than any of you do." Charles was again interrupted, but the argument continued. When pressed by the king, Bradshaw said again, "We sit here by the authority of the Commons of England, and that authority hath called your ancestors to account." "I deny that. Show me one precedent." "The point is not to be debated by you." "The Commons of England was never a court of judicature." "Confess or deny the charge." "By what authority do you sit?" "Take him away." "I do require that I may give my reasons." "'Tis not for a prisoner to require." "I am not an ordinary prisoner." Charles continued with this tactic on the third day of the trial, but this time the court simply read out the charges of treason against him, and when he refused to submit a plea, Bradshaw took Charles's plea to have been indicated by his previous deeds, observing, "You have written your meaning in bloody characters throughout the whole kingdom." With that, Charles was taken away under guard, where he remained while the trial continued in his absence. The king was then brought back on the 26th of January to hear the inevitable verdict. Bradshaw read it out. "For all which treasons and crimes this court doth adjudge that the said Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good of the people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body." Clamouring to speak but ignored, Charles was dragged away by the guards. The king's execution was set for the 30th of January, and a scaffold for that purpose was erected outside the banqueting hall in Whitehall, in London. Rising early that morning, the king dressed for the bitterly cold winter's day that awaited him. His loyal attendant, Thomas Herbert, remembered that Charles appointed that clothes he would wear, and said, "Let me have a shirt on more than ordinary, by reason the season is so sharp as probably may make me shake, which some observers will imagine proceeds from fear. I would have no such imputation. I fear not death." While Charles walked his dog one last time in St. James's Park, frantic efforts were being made behind the scenes to find an executioner actually willing to behead the king. The original man tasked with the job had pulled out at the last minute, and others, fearing the deep enmity that such an act would cause, also refused to do it. Eventually, a man was found who agreed to be the historic executioner, on condition he could wear a mask so that no one would know who he was. He was paid £100 for the task. Thousands had thronged to witness the extraordinary spectacle. One anonymous onlooker observed the scene as the king made his way to the banqueting hall. About 10 in the morning, the king was brought from St. James's, walking on foot through the park, with a regiment of foot, part before and part behind him, with colours flying, drums beating, his private guard of partisans with some of his gentlemen before and behind him, Dr. Juxon, the Bishop of London, next to him, and Colonel Tomlinson, who had charge of him, talking with the king bareheaded, from the park up the stairs into the gallery, and so into the cabinet chamber where he used to lie. There he continued at his devotion. He drank a glass of claret wine and ate a piece of bread at about 12 noon. From thence he was accompanied through the banqueting house adjoining to which the scaffold was erected between Whitehall Gate and the gate leading into the gallery from St. James's. The scaffold was hung round with black, and the floor covered with black, and the axe and the block laid in the middle of the scaffold. There were divers companies of food, and troops of horse placed on the one side of the scaffold towards King Street, and on the other side towards Charing Cross, and the multitudes of people that came to be spectators were very, very great. As a final humiliation, the block on which he was to be beheaded was set deliberately low, so that Charles would be forced to lie prostrate to put his head upon it. The king uttered his final words to the Bishop of London, William Juxon, who stood beside him on the scaffold, saying, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." Philip Henry, a 17-year-old London resident, witnessed the final scene of the king's execution. On the day of his execution, I stood among the crowds in the street before Whitehall Gate, where the scaffold was erected, and saw what was done, but was not so near as to hear anything. The blow I saw given, and can truly say with a sad heart, at the instant whereof I remember well, there was such a groan by the thousands then present as I never heard before, and desire that I may never hear again. A troop of soldiers immediately marched from Charing Cross to Westminster, and another from Westminster to Charing Cross, purposely to disperse and scatter the people, so that I had much ado among the rest to escape home without hurt. Writing of the trial and execution of King Charles 3 centuries later, Winston Churchill, a powerful and lifelong advocate and friend of the British monarchy, reflected bitterly on the act of regicide and the tyranny of Cromwell's rule that followed it. A strange destiny had engulfed this King of England. None had resisted with more untimely stubbornness the movement of his age. He had been in his heyday the convinced opponent of what we now call our parliamentary liberties. Yet as misfortunes crowded upon him, he increasingly became the physical embodiment of the liberties and traditions of England. His mistakes and wrong deeds had arisen not so much from personal cravings for arbitrary power as from the conception of kingship to which he was born, and which had long been the settled custom of the land. In the end he stood against an army which had destroyed all parliamentary government, and was about to plunge England into a tyranny at once more irresistible and more petty than any seen before or since. Of all the words spoken and written about the execution of this no ordinary prisoner, the simplest and most telling are of Cromwell himself, who, when asked why it was necessary the king should be beheaded, simply remarked, "Cruel necessity."